My daughter was ashamed to call me dad. She'd say I wasn't like the fathers in her school, not rich, not worthy, not handsome. Every time I showed up, she'd look away, pretending she didn't see me. But the day she found out who I really was, her reaction left me in shock. If this is your kind of story, stay till the end to see how it turns out. First, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and tell us where you're listening from in the comment section. I used to think that loving someone enough, truly, selflessly, would be enough to make them love you back. Turns out, that's not how it works, especially when you're a father trying to raise a daughter in a world that worships appearances. From the day Layla was born, I poured everything I had into her life. I gave up late nights, sold off my first car to pay for her nursery, and built a future with her needs always placed before mine. And yet, as she grew, something in her eyes changed. At first, it was subtle. She wouldn't introduce me to her friends, wouldn't let me drop her at school. But by the time she turned 13, her words cut clean through my chest like broken glass. I remember that afternoon too well. It was right after a parent-teacher meeting. I was walking toward her group of friends with the hope of handing her the lunch she forgot. She saw me and spun around, whispering fast to the girl next to her. When I called her name, she didn't even look back. Later that day, in the privacy of our kitchen, she said it. "You're not like the dads I see at school. You're not rich, you don't have a flashy car, and to top it all, you're so ugly. I don't even know what Mom saw in you." She was 14. I should have snapped back, should have reminded her who paid for her piano lessons, who skipped meals so she could go on school trips. But instead, I stood there with my mouth half open and my heart fully broken, watching the child I raised speak to me like I was a burden. I used to lie awake at night, wondering where I went wrong. My wife, Amma, always tried to comfort me, saying, "She's just young. She'll grow out of it." But it wasn't just youth. It was entitlement, embarrassment, and a kind of internalized shame that I didn't see coming. See, I chose to live simply, not because I didn't have money, but because I didn't want money to define my relationships. I didn't want people respecting me because of what I owned. I've watched too many men lose themselves in the chase for image, only to wake up one day in a mansion with no real love around them. That life never appealed to me. I built my first property at 28, flipped that into a complex of rental apartments by 32, and by the time Layla was 5, I already owned 10 buildings, quietly, anonymously. I even helped finance the construction of her school's new science lab, and later, the arts wing. But I never bragged about it. I dressed modestly, drove an old Honda Civic that rattled on startup, and never flashed watches or shoes. I wanted Layla to grow up treating the cleaner and the CEO with the same level of respect. But she didn't. She grew up idolizing the children whose fathers picked them up in Teslas and Range Rovers, who wore Rolexes and talked loudly about vacations in Dubai. And because I didn't play that game, she didn't see me. Not really. Every school event became a test of my patience and pride. I still went, because I'm her father, and that's what fathers do, but I learned to stop waving. I'd sit in the back, clapping quietly when her name was called, watching her eyes scan the crowd and skip past me. One time, during a group performance, she turned to the audience and waved. I thought it was for me. I waved back. She looked embarrassed, turned to her friend, and they both giggled. That night, she didn't speak a word to me, and I didn't ask why. The hardest part wasn't the silence. It was the slow erosion of the bond one thought we had. My wife would ask, "How long will you keep letting her treat you this way?" And I'd say, "She's my daughter. That's how long." Because there's something about being a father that makes you believe your love can outlast anything, even being unseen. But one day, something shifted in me. It wasn't a big moment. It was a Tuesday. Nothing dramatic happened, no outburst or confrontation. I had just come home from overseeing one of my new commercial properties. It was raining. I remember wiping the mud off my shoes in the corridor and hearing Layla laugh in the living room. She was on a video call with her friend, saying something like, "No, my dad's not rich. He's just, basic. Drives some ugly car and wears those ugly shirts." She didn't know I was home. I stood there for a full minute, water dripping from my umbrella, my chest heavy. That night, I didn't eat. I didn't argue. I just sat at the edge of my bed and realized I wasn't just being humble. I was being erased. And there's a difference. Still, I didn't confront her. I didn't expose my wealth or correct her lies. Part of me still hoped that one day she'd see me, not for what I had, but for who I was. I kept paying for her violin lessons, her ballet shoes, her tutoring sessions, and her school trips. I kept showing up for every event, even if she wouldn't look my way. I kept giving, and she kept pretending I didn't exist. But a man can only carry so much before his silence becomes its own kind of scream. And mine came the day I got a formal letter from her school, inviting me, to be the guest of honor for their speech and prize-giving day. Not because I was a student's parent, not because I was a known public figure, but because someone had finally looked into the files and realized the entire west wing of the school bore my name in the deed. They say when you choose to walk the quiet road, you must learn to be comfortable with being misunderstood. I chose that road a long time ago, long before Layla was even born. It wasn't because I lacked ambition or means. It was because I understood what wealth can do to a person's soul. I'd watched it happen to others. Friends who once shared meals with me at roadside chop bars now refused to eat anywhere that didn't serve imported wine. Men who had nothing to their names back in the day now couldn't have a conversation without reminding you who they were and what they owned. I knew early on that the moment your status starts to speak louder than your character, you've lost something sacred. So I made a vow to myself. Grow silently, move with dignity, and never let the zeros in your bank account determine your worth. I bought my first plot of land in Kasoa at 27 with money saved from odd jobs and a modest inheritance from my late uncle. That land became a 2-unit building, which I rented out for years until I could buy a second, then a third. I stayed behind the scenes, always using shell companies, rarely putting my name in lights. I built up a modest empire, one brick at a time, with the simple belief that if you do good work, your legacy won't need a billboard. But being invisible to the world has a price, and I paid it in full the day my daughter decided her father wasn't good enough. It wasn't the insult that broke me. It was the implication that everything I was doing, all the sacrifices I made, had somehow turned me into a figure of shame in her eyes. That all she saw when she looked at me was a man who couldn't compete. And the truth? I never tried to. I didn't wear gold chains or flash my car keys in conversations. I didn't throw money around at restaurants or try to impress her friends with fake charm. I thought I was teaching her something different, something deeper. But the world had gotten to her first. I remember once driving her to a birthday party. We pulled up to a huge house, and the moment I put the car in park, she slouched so low in her seat she was almost lying down. "Can you drop me 2 streets away?" she whispered, not looking at me. I chuckled, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. That was the last time I ever dropped her off anywhere. Alma saw the cracks forming before I did. She warned me, softly, cautiously. "You know Layla is growing up in a world that measures men by their shoes," she said one night as we lay in bed. I stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly, its squeak the only sound in the room. "Then let her grow differently," I replied. "Let her be the one who sees past it." But she didn't. She leaned into the lifestyle of her classmates, their influencers, the kids whose parents made sure their status showed. Meanwhile, I kept showing up in my worn-out sandals and weathered jeans. To her, I became the before picture in someone else's glow-up story. It hurt more than I can describe, but I kept my promise to live simply, to love deeply, and to never try and buy respect. Not even from my own daughter. When the letter from the school arrived, I almost threw it out. I thought it was another fundraiser or one of those generic acknowledgments they send to donors. But then I saw it, my name, printed boldly at the top. Mr. Kwame A. Dade, founder, Dade Estates, chairperson, annual speech, and prize-giving day. I sat down slowly, letting the paper rest on my lap. I must have read it 3 times, each line unraveling something in me. It wasn't the title that got to me. It was the idea that they finally saw me. That behind the old Honda and the plain shirts, someone had taken the time to trace the roots of the school's financial backbone. I'd built that school wing not because I needed the recognition, but because I believed in community growth. I even waived my profit margins when they ran short of funds, just to make sure the lab could be completed in time for the new session. And now, the same institution that once overlooked me as just another parent had extended an invitation for me to sit in the spotlight. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Alma was skeptical at first. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked as I held the letter in my hand. "It's her school. You know how she'll feel seeing you up there." I looked at her, eyes heavy. "Maybe it's time she knows who I really am," I said. "Not because I need her praise, but because I need to stop hiding." My wife nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. She had seen me swallow my pride too many times. Seen me walk out of Layla's room with my shoulders slumped just a little lower after each failed conversation. Seen me pretend I didn't hear the things our daughter said about me under her breath. She knew this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't need to shout. I didn't tell Layla. I didn't prepare a grand speech or buy a new suit. I did what I always did, kept things simple. The day of the event, I wore my usual button-down shirt and slacks, polished my old shoes, and drove to the school in my dependable Honda. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw rows of luxury cars, BMWs, Mercedes, even a matte black Tesla. I smiled to myself. Status parade, as usual. I parked at the far end and made my way inside quietly, just another face in the crowd. But this time, I wasn't just the father she avoided. I was the guest of honor. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't going to shrink myself to make my own daughter comfortable. I didn't sleep the night before the event. Not out of anxiety. No, I'd stood before crowds larger than a school hall, presented to business partners, negotiated deals that could collapse under a wrong word. But this was different. This wasn't a speech to strangers or shareholders. This was a silent conversation with my daughter, carried on the current of an entire room's attention. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the soft sound of Alma's breathing beside me the only rhythm I could follow. Over the years, I had made peace with Layla's rejection. At least, I told myself I had. But something about tomorrow stirred old hopes I thought I'd buried. What if, just what if, this was the moment she saw me? Not the man in a dusty car. Not the embarrassment she avoided. But me. The man who carried her on his back when she was 5 and afraid of thunder. The man who sold his first 2 plots just to pay for her primary school deposit. The man who stood behind the curtain while she danced at recitals, clapping silently, praying she'd look his way. I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition, quiet, unforced, and real. Morning came too fast. I ironed my shirt myself, blue cotton, no logos, no fuss, and picked out slacks that hadn't seen daylight in months. Alma offered to drive me, but I declined. That car, my old, faithful Honda, had carried me through years of struggle and success. If I was going to be seen, it would be from behind that wheel. The drive was quiet. I didn't play music. I didn't rehearse the speech. I simply watched the streets pass, watched people walk, sell, live, unaware of the small war unraveling inside me. The closer I got to the school, the heavier my chest felt. Not from fear, but from something more fragile, anticipation. The school had changed since the last time I saw it up close. The landscaping was more polished. The new wing I funded stood tall and proud, its fresh paint glinting in the sun. I parked near the staff block, away from the flashy lineup of vehicles outside the main entrance. Teslas, G-Wagons, Porsche SUVs, all lined up like trophies. I stepped out and brushed the dust off my sleeves. A few parents passed me by, not recognizing me, not knowing I held the title deed to half the land beneath their children's classroom floors. That's how I preferred it. Quiet legacy, silent impact. But today, I wasn't there to hide. Inside the auditorium, the staff buzzed with last-minute arrangements. A young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, spotted me and hurried over with a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Dade?" she asked, slightly breathless. I nodded. She grinned, a little nervous. "We're honored to have you. Please, right this way." She led me to the front row, where a small card bore my name in thick, gold letters. I sat and waited, my hands folded in my lap. Students began filing in, chattering and laughing, unaware that the man seated in plain clothes at the front had helped build the very space they were sitting in. Then I saw her. Layla. She walked in with a group of girls, her uniform neat, hair styled, laughing like the weight of the world couldn't touch her. She glanced at the front, scanning for familiar faces, then looked past me without pause. I didn't flinch. I didn't wave. I just sat there. The MC, a young, energetic man with a booming voice, began the program. Speeches, awards, performances. I clapped at the right times, nodded politely. And then, the moment came. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced, we are especially honored today to be joined by a man whose quiet generosity has shaped the very fabric of this institution. He is the mind and muscle behind the development of our new learning blocks, a pioneer in community-based real estate, and a man whose humility matches his success. Please welcome our guest of honor and keynote speaker, Mr. Kwame Dade. The room applauded, politely at first. Then louder. I rose slowly, adjusting my shirt cuffs out of habit. But my eyes were locked on one face. Layla's. Her jaw dropped. Her brows drew together in confusion, then disbelief. She turned to the girl beside her, saying something I couldn't hear. Her head whipped back toward the stage. I saw her lips move, Dad. Then, as I walked past her row, she stood. That's my dad, she shouted. Heads turned. People stared. A hush fell. But I didn't break stride. I didn't turn. I kept walking to the podium, the applause rising again behind me, unsure now if it was for the speech or the spectacle. I stood before the microphone, heart calm, mind clear. I delivered the speech I had written not for admiration, but for truth. I spoke about building with intention, about value beyond vanity, about how some legacies are poured into concrete, not carved into gold. I never once mentioned her name, but I didn't need to. Every word was for her. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, but all I heard was the silence between me and my daughter, the space that had finally cracked open, letting light through. I left right after the ceremony, politely declined lunch, shook a few hands, then walked back to my car. She didn't follow. I didn't wait. I started the engine, rolled down the window, and drove home as quietly as I'd arrived. Behind me, the school gates closed, and with them, a chapter of invisibility. I didn't speak a word to anyone on the drive home. My fingers rested lightly on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road, but my mind was back there, in that auditorium, in that singular moment when Layla stood up and claimed me. It was surreal, hearing those words spill from her lips. Not just Dad, but that's my dad. Loud, proud, almost desperate. The same girl who, for years, pretended not to know me in public had shouted my name in front of hundreds. Part of me should have felt vindicated. Part of me should have smiled, nodded, basked in the warmth of a long-overdue acknowledgement. But I didn't. I felt cold, hollow even, because it didn't come from love. It came from shock, from sudden status. She didn't see me. She saw what the room saw, a man with titles and silent wealth. And I couldn't ignore how swiftly admiration bloomed when bank statements entered the picture. When I got home, Amma was waiting. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching my car pull up like she already knew I wouldn't be the same man who left that morning. I stepped out, gave her a tired smile, and walked past her into the house without a word. She followed me to the kitchen, leaned on the counter as I poured myself a glass of water. So, she asked softly. I shook my head. She shouted it, as if she's always known me, as if she's proud. Amma's face didn't move. She just studied me the way she does when I'm too tired to lie. And that's a bad thing? She asked. I turned to her, the rim of the glass still pressed to my lips. It's not real. It's recognition by reputation, not relationship. She was embarrassed by me until she found out what other people now know. That's not pride. That's performance. Amma exhaled, slow and deep, and left me alone in the kitchen. There was nothing else to say. Later that evening, around 8, I heard the front door creak open. Layla's footsteps were light, almost uncertain, so different from the confident stomp I'd come to associate with her. She didn't call out like she usually did. No, Mom, I'm home. Just silence. I stayed in the study, pretending to be busy with some documents, but I heard her walking slowly down the hallway, pausing outside my door. Then, 2 soft knocks. I didn't respond. She opened it anyway. Dad? She said, hesitating in the doorway like it wasn't her house. Can we talk? I looked up from my desk, met her eyes, and said nothing. She stepped in, closed the door behind her, and stood there, arms crossed like a schoolgirl waiting to be scolded. Why didn't you ever tell me? She asked. Why didn't you say you were like that? Her voice trembled on the last word, as if she couldn't quite define what that meant. Rich, respected, revered. I leaned back in my chair, my hands folded across my stomach. Would it have made a difference? I asked quietly. She blinked, caught off guard. Of course it would have. I mean, I wouldn't have. She trailed off, guilt wrapping itself around her throat. I gave her a long look, measured and steady. Then I said, if I have to tell you how rich I am just for you to recognize me as your father, then I don't need it. She stood frozen, her face crumbling like wet paper. No more defenses. No more sarcasm. Just raw, open shame. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know. I was stupid. I didn't mean all those things I said. I nodded slightly, but said nothing. She waited, eyes searching mine for some sign of forgiveness, some crack in the wall I had built in seconds but took years to justify. I turned my chair back toward the desk. You should go to bed, I said. It's late. Her lips parted, maybe to argue, maybe to beg. But she nodded instead and left the room. Over the next few days, she tried everything. Made breakfast. Offered to help in the garden. Watched the news with me, pretending she cared about the economy. Every gesture was small, almost endearing. But I didn't give her what she wanted. I wasn't cruel, but I was cold. Not out of spite, but because I needed her to sit in the discomfort. To feel what it was like to chase a version of someone you once discarded. I grounded her, not in the traditional sense, but I did take her phone, canceled 2 outings she had planned, and told her she was to stay in the house for a month. No sleepovers. No mall runs. Just home, school, and reflection. She didn't protest. Not once. That silence was louder than any apology. Alma watched it all unfold with quiet restraint. She never interfered, though I could see her heart breaking in the corners of her eyes. One night, as we lay in bed, she touched my hand gently. You know she means it, right? I sighed. Maybe she does now, but she didn't before, and I need her to understand the weight of that. Alma didn't argue. She just nodded and turned off the lamp. Weeks passed, slowly, like molasses, but something began to change. Layla stopped trying to impress me. Instead, she started asking questions. Real ones. About how I got started. About why I never put my name on anything. About the people I helped along the way. She sat through my stories, nodded, took notes. Sometimes she asked for advice on school projects. Sometimes she just sat in the room, silent but present. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy. But it was something. And eventually, I softened. Not because I forgot, but because I saw her trying, truly trying, to understand the man she once couldn't even acknowledge in public. I forgave her quietly, without ceremony. One evening, I passed her a bowl of soup and said, no more grounding. She smiled, teary-eyed, and whispered, thanks, Dad. That was all. No grand gestures. No sappy speech. Just 3 words that finally felt real again. It's strange how silence can feel heavier than shouting. After I told Layla those words, if I have to tell you how rich I am for you to recognize me, then I don't need it. Our house settled into a quiet rhythm that didn't feel like peace. It felt like penance. She moved through the hallways carefully, like every creaking floorboard might trigger another disappointment. And to be honest, I wasn't sure how I wanted her to behave. Part of me wanted her to lash out again, to be the same arrogant girl who once looked at me like I was something stuck to the bottom of her shoes, because that girl was familiar, predictable. But this new version of her, the quiet, cautious, self-aware Layla, she unsettled me. She apologized in ways words never could. I caught her washing dishes without being asked, folding laundry that wasn't hers, making dinner and pretending it was just a hobby. None of it erased what had been said, but it chipped away at the stone wall I'd placed between us. Slowly, deliberately. Every day, I wondered if I was being too harsh. After all, she was a teenager, impressionable, insecure, constantly surrounded by kids who treated wealth as the final measure of worth. But then I'd remember the way she looked right through me at school events, the way she slouched in the passenger seat like my presence alone embarrassed her, the way she spat those cruel words in the kitchen that day, and I'd steel myself again. I didn't want her to be perfect. I just wanted her to see. See the man, not the myth. See the sacrifice, not the status. That's why I hadn't told her all those years. I needed her love to be blind to the things that money made visible. I needed her to value character before capital. But the truth is, maybe that was asking too much of a child who was raised in a world where perception is currency and image is everything. One Saturday morning, I was in the garden pruning the hibiscus bushes when she came out, barefoot, in her oversized hoodie and pajama shorts. She stood quietly at first, then stepped closer and picked up the spare shears. "Can I help?" she asked. I looked at her hands, delicate, not used to thorns or dirt, but I nodded. She knelt beside me, clipping the edges like she'd seen me do 100 times before. After a few minutes, she spoke again. "I didn't know you were building anything." Her voice was low, like she was scared of waking the truth. "I mean businesses, buildings." "You never said." I shrugged, still focused on a stubborn branch. I wasn't building to be noticed. I was building to provide. She was quiet again. Then, "But I would have treated you differently if I knew." I froze. There it was. The confession. The honesty. Brutal in its simplicity. She didn't mean it to hurt, but it landed like a punch to the ribs. I stood up, wiped my hands on a rag, and looked down at her. "Exactly," I said. "And that's the problem." She sat back on her heels, eyes wide. "I mean, no, that's not what I meant. She trailed off, unsure whether to backpedal or double down. "Layla," I said calmly, "when you love someone only because they've become what others admire, it's not love. It's convenience." She looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. And I respected her more in that moment than I had in years. She was learning to sit with discomfort, to let hard truths marinate without rushing to wipe them away. Over the next few weeks, our relationship evolved, slowly, like dawn cracking through a stormy night. She started asking deeper questions, and not just about me, but about herself. She wanted to know why she cared so much about appearances, why she felt so ashamed when she didn't measure up to her friends' families. One evening, we sat in the living room, just the two of us, with the fan humming overhead. "Was it wrong for me to want more?" she asked. Her voice was almost trembling. "To wish my dad was like the other dads?" I took a long breath before answering. "It's not wrong to wish," I said, "but it's dangerous to confuse surface with substance. A flashy car doesn't mean love. A designer suit doesn't make someone dependable. The man who shows up every day, even when ignored, insulted, or dismissed, that's the man worth admiring." She didn't speak. She just nodded slowly, her eyes welling up. I didn't reach out to wipe her tears. I let them fall. Alma watched all of this unfold with cautious hope. She never inserted herself into our private conversations, but I'd catch her watching us from the kitchen, her hand resting on her chest like she was afraid the moment might dissolve if she breathed too loudly. One night, after Layla had gone to bed, Alma leaned against the bedroom doorframe and whispered, "You're bringing her back." I looked up from my book and said, "No, she's bringing herself back." But even as Layla and I found our way toward each other, I couldn't ignore the quiet ache that lingered. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about something deeper, grief for the years lost to resentment. The birthdays I spent alone at the back of the school hall. The Father's Days where I received nothing but silence. You don't just move past that. You carry it, like an old injury that still throbs when the weather changes. And I knew I'd always carry it. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because it reminded me of how easily love can be conditional when we don't teach our children what truly matters. So yes, I forgave her. And yes, I loved her. But I also learned that sometimes love has to hurt before it heals. That a father's job isn't just to provide, but to protect the truth, even when it makes him the villain in his child's eyes. I had stayed silent all those years not out of pride, but out of principle. And in the end, that silence taught her more than words ever could. There's something quiet and humbling about reconciliation, real reconciliation, the kind that isn't announced with balloons or wrapped in social media posts. It happens in the small spaces, in the pauses between old habits and new behaviors. That's how it was with Layla. We didn't have a big moment where everything was fixed. There was no cinematic hug in the rain, no weeping apology at the airport. What we had was silence, followed by small, deliberate changes. She stopped avoiding eye contact. She started sitting next to me during evening news without being asked. Once, I caught her watching me as I fixed the hinges on the kitchen cabinet. Not with disgust or detachment, but curiosity. A genuine interest in the man she had once dismissed as ugly and basic. And though those words still echoed in the far corners of my memory, I let them fade into background noise. Not because they didn't matter, but because they no longer defined her. The final test of our fragile progress came unexpectedly one evening. It was a Friday. I remember because I had just gotten off a long call with one of my site managers. The workers had hit a pipe during excavation, and the repairs would cost double what we'd budgeted. I was in no mood for drama. As I sank into the living room chair, Layla walked in with her laptop and said, "I need help." I looked up, slightly irritated. She turned the screen toward me. "My economics project. I have to explain how investment compounds over time. I figured, maybe you'd know something about that." I blinked, not at the question, but at the humility behind it. This was the same girl who once told her friends I was probably a mechanic. The same girl who asked to be dropped off 2 blocks away so no one would see my car. And now she was asking me, to guide her through a project on finance. I took the laptop, adjusted my glasses, and said, "All right, let's begin." For the next hour, I explained compound interest using examples from my own journey. How I bought one property, then reinvested the profits to build another and another. She listened, took notes, and even asked follow-up questions. But what struck me most wasn't her attentiveness. It was her respect. Not the forced kind. Not the performative, "Yes, sir, kids give when they're trying to earn something." It was subtle, sincere. She didn't interrupt. She didn't scoff. She looked at me the way a student looks at a mentor. And for the first time in years, I felt like her father again. Not the man she had to tolerate, but the man she finally chose to learn from. Later that night, Alma found me in the backyard staring up at the stars. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and sat beside me. "You're smiling," she said. I didn't even realize I was. I nodded. She's asking questions now. Listening. Not because I forced her to, but because she wants to understand. Alma placed her hand on mine. "She's learning to love you for the right reasons." I looked at her, a tired kind of joy swelling in my chest. Maybe, or maybe she's learning to love herself differently, and that's bringing her back to me. Alma smiled and leaned her head on my shoulder. Either way, it's working. Not long after, Layla did something that nearly broke me in the best way. She came home from school, threw her bag on the couch, and called out, "Dad, can I talk to you?" I was in the kitchen, rinsing rice. I called back, "Sure, come in." She walked in holding a folded sheet of paper. I wrote something for a school competition. We had to write about someone we admire, and she stopped, suddenly nervous. "Can I read it to you?" I wiped my hands and nodded. She unfolded the paper and began. "The man I admire most is someone no one notices at first. He doesn't wear designer clothes. He doesn't speak loudly. He drives an old car and wears plain shoes. But behind that quiet exterior is a mind that built homes, a heart that gave without demanding thanks, and a strength that never needed an audience. He is my father, and I didn't always see him, but I do now." She didn't cry when she read it. I didn't either. But after she finished, she stood there for a second, waiting for my reaction. I simply reached out, pulled her into a hug, and said, "Thank you." That was all we needed. There are wounds that don't close completely, and maybe they're not meant to. Maybe they stay just open enough to remind us of how far we've come. I'll never forget the years she spent pretending I didn't exist. I'll never erase the words she threw like daggers when she thought wealth was the only currency worth anything. But I also won't forget how she changed. How she sat with her guilt and turned it into growth. How she started calling me Dad, again, not out of duty, but out of devotion. And maybe the greatest gift of all wasn't her apology, it was her honesty. Her willingness to admit that she was wrong, that she had been shallow, that she'd chased illusions until they collapsed. That's a kind of courage you can't teach. It has to come from within. I still drive the same car, still wear the same shirts, still sit in the back at events, unless I'm invited otherwise. But now, when I'm in the audience and they call Layla's name, she scans the crowd and smiles directly at me. She waves, sometimes even blows a kiss. Her friends know who I am now, not because she brags, but because she no longer hides me. And that is all I ever wanted. To be seen. Fully. Truthfully, not through the lens of status, but through the lens of love. I'll never forget what she said that day in the kitchen. I'll never pretend it didn't leave a scar. But I'll also never forget what came after. The change, the growth, the long, hard road back to each other. Because no matter how deep the hurt, no matter how long the silence, blood is still blood. And sometimes, the best way to teach someone how to love you is to walk away just long enough for them to realize what they're losing. Have you ever felt invisible to the people you love the most? Like your worth was only recognized after the world saw your success? If this story touched you or reminded you of your own quiet struggles, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more powerful real-life stories, and share it with someone who might need to hear that their value goes far beyond what money can buy. Sometimes, the loudest lessons come from the quietest families. See you soon in the next story.